A CIA archivist reviewing declassified Cold War correspondence in '94 discovers an unsigned love letter, written in code. The letter leads to the unraveling of a decades-old intelligence disaster. What begins as a tender confession ends up exposing one of the KGB's best-kept secrets because of love. In the cold shadows of 1982 East Berlin, a Soviet spy named Alexei Morozov begins a quiet, forbidden romance with a university linguistics student, Annika Bauer. She isn't a threat, just curious, intelligent, and deeply unaware of the secrets he carries. But love doesn't follow protocol, and when Alexei lowers his guard, what starts as intimacy turns into vulnerability. Within months, their private affair will spark a chain reaction, one that unravels a hidden KGB spy network operating inside NATO's core. This is the true story of how a single love letter led to one of the most accidental intelligence failures of the Cold War. Alexei Morozov arrived in East Berlin in early spring of 1982, the chill of winter still lingering in the gray streets and under the iron skies of the divided city, his identity carefully constructed as a mid-ranking cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy, a diplomatic role rich in pleasantries and protocol, but in truth, a thin veil for his real function as a KGB field operative, assigned to monitor NATO-adjacent German institutions and cultivate potential assets within intellectual and media circles. He was methodical, disciplined, and well-trained in the quiet paranoia of espionage, but none of his briefings had prepared him for the chance encounter that would undo him. It happened at a midweek film screening, hosted by the Humboldt University Film Club, a harmless propaganda affair on Soviet-German cultural solidarity, poorly attended, save for a few bored students and embassy affiliates. She sat 3 rows in front of him, tall, with dark, untamed hair, a scarf loosely wrapped around her neck, taking notes in a tiny leather notebook, and occasionally mouthing observations to herself. Her name, as he would later learn, was Annika Bauer, a linguistics student with a disarming laugh and a reputation for probing questions that walked the line between academic curiosity and political provocation. Their first exchange was brief, a comment he made about the clumsy editing of the archival footage, which she met with a grin and a challenge. "Do you always criticize films shown by your own government?" Spoken in German so crisp it startled him. She didn't know he was KGB, of course. To her, he was just another bureaucrat with too much time and a fondness for state cinema. But that night, he lingered after the event, and so did she. They talked on the steps outside the theater while the streetlights buzzed overhead and trams clattered in the distance. Her mind was a whirlwind of historical references, philosophical tangents, and subtle jabs at ideology that Alexei found both dangerous and irresistible. Over the following weeks, they saw each other again. Casual coffee meetings after lectures, long walks along the Spree, quiet dinners where she peppered him with questions, and he deflected with just enough truth to keep her intrigued. He told himself it was useful to know her, that her cousin's role in a West German newspaper made her a valuable proximity, but something shifted. He began lying to his handler about these encounters, omitting them from his reports, brushing off her background as irrelevant. With each meeting, the line between surveillance and sincerity blurred, and in stolen moments between their intellectual sparring, he found himself watching her more than he should have, noticing the way she bit her lip when concentrating, or how she reflexively reached for the edge of his sleeve when laughing. It was a subtle thing, quiet and unsanctioned. But in a city built on walls and secrets, Alexei Morozov was doing the one thing no KGB officer was allowed to do. He was falling in love. Alexei Morozov had been trained to compartmentalize with ruthless efficiency, to fold emotions into locked rooms inside the mind and bury them beneath protocol, but somewhere between the 3rd and 7th time he met Annika, the structure began to bend under pressure he refused to acknowledge. It started with small transgressions, staying 15 minutes past his diplomatic curfew to walk her home, claiming embassy errands when he was really sitting beside her in a smoky bookshop, discussing syntax and Kafka, then skipping a scheduled dead drop near Friedrichshain, forcing a junior courier to cover for him while he scribbled poetry on hotel stationery under a pseudonym. He whispered only to himself, his Russian words weaving metaphors she'd never read, but that felt safer written than spoken. The poems were raw, unfinished, verses about dissonance and dislocation, about cold cities and warmer hands, and though he never dared give them to her, he carried folded kabuzs in his coat pocket like contraband. The KGB manual warned of the slow leak of operational integrity, likening it to frostbite, painless at first, then irreversible. And yet he still found himself confessing things he shouldn't during their meandering walks. Childhood memories of lakes in Ryazan, his favorite passage in Eugene Onegin, the fear that his postings would outlive any personal connection he tried to forge. Annika listened with the soft silence of someone who knew what not to ask, but even her unspoken curiosity tightened something in his chest. Meanwhile, across the courtyard from his state-issued apartment, a pensioner named Frau Beck, whose husband had once been a party loyalist before retiring into silent disapproval, noticed that Alexei had taken to wearing civilian clothes that were too tailored, that he now returned late on Tuesdays, sometimes with fresh flowers and a vague smile, and that on more than one occasion, the sound of Western jazz had filtered faintly from his window around midnight. She documented this as bourgeois indulgence in her quiet, looping cursive, and submitted it during her monthly citizen observation appointment with her Stasi contact, a thin man who filed the report without comment, marking it for low-level monitoring under the heading Cultural Deviation. A week later, an entry was made in the Stasi database, Morozov, Alexei V., USSR, Diplomatic ID 496B, minor suspicion, aesthetic nonconformity. Cameras weren't installed, but a young East German agent, fresh from the academy, was tasked with trailing Alexei twice weekly and taking notes. The KGB station chief in Berlin was informed of the file, but dismissed it. The Stasi were paranoid and sloppy, and Morozov, while eccentric, was considered dependable, but the cracks were spreading. Alexei missed another drop 2 weeks later, and when confronted, he lied effortlessly, the words flowing out as if reciting from a script he hadn't written. He didn't feel guilt, only the awareness that the line he'd sworn never to cross had quietly vanished behind him. And every time Annika touched his hand in public, or smiled at something he said, he felt both elevated and exposed, like a man standing in sunlight for the first time in years, unaware that the warmth was beginning to burn. It was a quiet Thursday evening when the boundaries Alexei Morozov had so carefully managed began to dissolve in earnest. The air inside Annika's apartment dense with the scent of cheap red wine and the low hum of a scratched jazz record playing on repeat, the kind of music frowned upon by censors but adored by the curious and the defiant. They'd already drained 2 glasses each, the bottle dwindling between them on her desk, and the conversation, once grounded in politics, then veering into absurd philosophy, turned personal, messy, and unguarded. Alexei, loosened by the alcohol and lulled by the softness of her breath on his shoulder, began to speak in elliptical phrases about the weight of duty, the suffocation of expectation, of people who watch without seeing, and codes written not on paper but in behavior. Annika, who had long suspected that her lover's diplomatic responsibilities were deeper than reported, let him talk, her eyes half-lidded, a playful smile hiding behind curiosity. He didn't name names, didn't reveal specifics, but his cadence changed, measured, rhythmic, suggestive of rehearsed signals passed between agents. At one point, sprawled across her pillow, he murmured something about a failed drop near Friedrichshain, and how the courier panicked and didn't break the trail, then scoffed and muttered, "But of course, they'll still think it's my fault. They always do." She laughed, unsure whether he was joking or venting or performing for effect. And on a whim, half in jest, half in fascination, she reached over to her desk drawer and retrieved the small voice recorder she used to practice her English pronunciation exercises. "For posterity," she joked, clicking it on with a flourish and placing it beside him on the pillow. Alexei glanced at it, then smirked and said, "Then let's make it poetry," continuing to speak in a tone rich with metaphor, references to signals dropped in daylight and watchers who become watched. The recording lasted 27 minutes. The next afternoon, nursing a mild hangover and sorting through her papers for a seminar, Annika found the recorder and, on impulse, played it back. It was chaotic, half-mumbled, half-performative, but intriguing. Later that evening, while visiting her cousin Christian, an assistant editor for a West German-leaning underground publication in the American sector, she played it for him, expecting laughter or dismissal. Instead, he went still. Twice, He paused the tape and rewound it. By the end, he looked at her not as a cousin, but as a source. "Do you know what this sounds like?" he asked quietly, almost reverently. "This isn't just drunken rambling. This is the rhythm of Tradecraft. He's not just some bored bureaucrat. This is how handlers talk. Layered metaphors, compartmentalized language, no direct subjects. This is structured. Someone trained him to speak this way." Anika froze, the joke souring in her throat. She hadn't meant to expose anything, but Christian was already pacing, the gears turning in his journalist's mind. "If he's who I think he is," he said, "you're not sleeping with a diplomat. You're sleeping with a spy." And just like that, the intimacy that had felt so private became radioactive. Christian Bauer had made a career out of navigating shadows. His work for the underground press straddled the fine line between sanctioned journalism and subversive inquiry, and though he wasn't officially aligned with Western intelligence, he'd cultivated relationships with sources who were. 2 days after hearing the recording from Anika's apartment, he sat in a corner booth at a cafe near the Tiergarten, nursing a coffee he didn't touch, waiting for a man he only knew as Lang, a supposed cultural liaison for the U.S. Embassy in Bonn, who in reality was a CIA field liaison with a reputation for turning whispers into dossiers. When Lang arrived, Christian slid him a small envelope with the cassette tape, no names, just a date and location. "Something strange," he said. "Might be nothing, but listen to the way he talks. It's not normal." Lang didn't press for details. His job wasn't to interrogate civilian sources, but to process and analyze. Within 24 hours, the tape was inside a CIA signal analysis unit outside Bonn, where a linguistics officer trained in Soviet operational jargon flagged no less than 17 phrase patterns consistent with known KGB field communication. Phrases that mimicked code structure without explicitly being code, the kind of syntax used by agents to rehearse or obliquely reference fieldwork while preserving plausible deniability. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough. Lang contacted his superior at Langley with a short brief: potential field compromise. Source: East Berlin. Probable Soviet operator embedded under diplomatic cover. Recommend passive surveillance. No host nation notification. The message triggered the opening of a preliminary file on subject V312, alias Alexei Morozov. The CIA's Berlin station, already burdened with its constant cat-and-mouse game against the Stasi and the KGB Residentura, assigned 2 non-official cover assets to begin discreet visual tailing of Morozov's movements. No contact, no direct engagement, just observation. Cameras were installed across from the Soviet cultural wing, angled subtly through the slats of an abandoned building. On paper, Morozov remained a low-priority diplomat. But the moment his face was matched to internal surveillance snapshots from a 1979 Moscow file, one tagged with counter-intel interest pending, his status changed. The CIA had no intention of alerting the Germans, especially not the Stasi, whose own informant networks were compromised and frequently repurposed by the KGB. Instead, this would be a slow burn, a quiet watch. Every errand, every lunch break, every deviation from embassy routine was logged. Analysts noted he often walked alone, rarely took the embassy car, and occasionally disappeared for windows of 20 to 40 minutes with no traceable pattern. On one occasion, a tale followed him to a bookstore near Prenzlauer Berg, where he purchased a rare German edition of Pushkin. Annotated, the name on the receipt was fake, but the handwriting matched a list already under analysis. Lang's report back to Langley was succinct. Target exhibits signs of tradecraft degradation, possible emotional entanglement. Source recording likely authentic. Recommend continued monitoring. What had begun as a drunken pillow talk anecdote now had a case number. And in the labyrinth of Cold War espionage, those numbers didn't just represent suspects, they represented cracks in enemy walls. This one had started with a kiss. Alexei Morozov wrote the letter on a Sunday afternoon when the embassy halls were quiet and the city outside seemed suspended in a gray, breathless pause, the kind that made East Berlin feel less like a capital and more like a sealed room. And he wrote it knowing, though he refused to admit it fully, that it might be the last unfiltered truth he would ever allow himself to put into words. Rumors of reassignment had begun circulating inside the embassy, subtle shifts in tone from his handler, a sudden request for updated travel readiness, the quiet removal of his name from a cultural exchange scheduled for autumn, all signs he recognized instantly as the prelude to extraction or redeployment. And with reassignment came disappearance, the kind that left no forwarding address and no explanations. He could not explain this to Anika, not directly, not honestly, so instead he reached for the only language that felt safe, poetry layered with meaning only she would notice. The letter was handwritten in blue ink on thick, unmarked paper, his script unusually careful, each line measured, as if the physical act of writing might slow the inevitable. On the surface it read like a farewell meditation on distance and time, references to shared walks along the river, a joke about her correcting his German articles, an image of streetlights flickering near Alexanderplatz. But beneath the tenderness were markers, subtle anchors tied to their private conversations, phrases lifted from her favorite linguistic theories, a metaphor about dropped syllables and silent consonants that echoed a joke she'd once made about unspoken meanings, even a reference to Friedrichshain, written not as a place, but as a misplaced pause, a formulation that mirrored the way he'd once complained about a failed operation without ever naming it. To Alexei, it was simply intimacy disguised as literature, a way to say goodbye without saying goodbye, but to anyone trained to look for patterns, it was something else entirely. He mailed it from a public box 2 districts away, a habit drilled into him years earlier, and then waited, the anxiety settling into his chest like wet cement. Weeks passed, and then, without warning, Anika's apartment was raided, not for him, not for espionage, but for her tangential involvement in a student petition protesting academic censorship, an offense minor enough to warrant intimidation rather than arrest, but sufficient for a Stasi search order. They went through her books, her notes, her tapes, and her correspondence, bagging everything that looked even vaguely political, including Alexei's letter, which sat folded inside a linguistics journal on her desk. The Stasi officer who cataloged it found nothing remarkable beyond its tone and passed it along with the rest. But the letter didn't stop there. Through a quiet interagency exchange meant to flag Western contacts, it found its way into the hands of West German counterintelligence analysts, one of whom froze halfway through the second paragraph, struck by a structural familiarity he hadn't expected in something so personal. The metaphors weren't random. The rhythm wasn't artistic accident. When the text was overlaid against archived KGB communications recovered in the late 1970s, a pattern emerged, an identical method of embedding operational references inside civilian language, a cipher technique designed to survive casual reading while remaining legible to trained eyes. By the time Anika was released with a warning and a shaken silence, her love letter had already been copied, annotated, and logged under a new heading, one that did not mention romance at all, but compromise. The embassy hallways felt colder that week, not because of the weather, but because of the silence that had begun to bloom around Alexei Morozov like frost on glass, invisible at first, then unmistakable. The shift was subtle but undeniable, his name removed from internal circulations, colleagues who had once shared bitter coffee in the staff room now offering tight nods without eye contact, and a courier who normally greeted him with quiet familiarity suddenly avoiding him altogether. Something was wrong. He had sent no messages out of band, made no overt missteps in his reports, but the silence spoke volumes, and silence was not neutral, it was diagnostic. Suspecting a breach, or worse, a purge in motion, Alexei did the unthinkable. He submitted a formal request for exfiltration, coded in diplomatic channels under pre-approved contingency language, citing emerging operational instability and compromised forward posture as justifications. A red flag within the KGB's own apparatus that signaled something had gone terribly wrong. He expected, at the very least, a coded response, some acknowledgement, a protocol engagement. Instead, he received nothing, not a word, not a reprimand, not a directive. Days turned into a week, and the embassy mail drop, once checked twice daily, suddenly produced no packets with his mark. When he asked about updates from Moscow, the operations officer on duty shrugged, offering only, "Moscow's reviewing priorities," before quickly changing the subject. The isolation was surgical. No warnings, no confrontations, only space. Space designed to test him, to see if he'd panic, if he'd run, if he'd slip. But Alexei wasn't just paranoid now, he was certain. They knew. Or worse, they suspected but didn't know. And that meant the full weight of Directorate K was watching from the shadows, waiting for confirmation, waiting for proof, waiting for him to reveal what they feared, that he had formed an attachment, that he had spoken out of turn, that he had broken the cardinal law of discipline. Anika's name he dared not speak aloud, not even in private. He retraced every moment in his mind, every walk, every letter, every touch, and began to see with agonizing clarity the places where emotion had eclipsed caution. The love letter, the poems, the missed dead drops, the night he had spoken in riddles on her bed. The Stasi had always kept files. Perhaps one had been quietly passed to Moscow. Or perhaps it had come from inside, one of his own, a colleague who saw too much, who said too little. Whatever the source, Moscow had made its judgment. The extraction request had been his last chance, and the absence of reply wasn't oversight, it was confirmation. He had been burned, not by the enemy, but by his own command, and worse, by himself. Every instinct now screamed at him to disappear, to go underground, to vanish into the machinery of the city, but he knew that wouldn't save him. The KGB did not forgive betrayal, and in their eyes, betrayal did not require proof. It only required doubt, and doubt had already closed its hand around his name. The love letter that had once trembled in Alexei's fingers, a quiet ode to affection wrapped in poetic code, had now become a scalpel in the hands of the CIA, sharp enough to slice through the tissue of Soviet clandestine operations with surgical precision. After the linguistics analyst in Bonn flagged the structural patterns embedded within its verses, the document was rushed to Langley, where a specialized cryptanalysis team mapped its cadences against a decades-old file containing KGB dead-drop formatting and safehouse ciphers recovered from defectors. What emerged stunned even the veterans. The metaphors in the letter didn't just mimic Tradecraft, they mirrored it exactly. Phrases describing rooms behind forgotten doors and windows shuttered in rhythm correlated directly with a known pattern of KGB safehouse nomenclature. Each poetic line a disguised reference to operational protocols used across Western Europe. Alarmed and exhilarated, the CIA expanded their search, feeding the letter's linguistic DNA into a database of recent intercepts and surveillance reports. The results snowballed. Within weeks, they identified common markers in field reports from Brussels, The Hague, and Strasbourg. One phrase, "where the clocks run counter to the sun," matched the address of a Belgian courier node long suspected but never confirmed. Another, "beneath the eyes of stone men," led to a surveillance camera trained on a Zurich apartment nestled beneath a sculpture gallery. These weren't coincidences, they were keys. By the time the second month closed, 4 KGB operatives embedded in NATO-adjacent positions across Western Europe had been arrested in coordinated raids, 2 in Luxembourg, 1 in Lyon, and another, shockingly, in a British military liaison office in Bonn. 2 more vanished entirely, likely exfiltrated or burned by their own command. The net result was catastrophic for Soviet intelligence. 6 compromised nodes in less than 60 days. A tempo of disruption so fast it left Moscow scrambling. Panic spread through the KGB's first chief directorate like fire through dry grass. Emergency audits were ordered. Internal communications were combed for breaches. Case officers were pulled from field assignments for debriefs, interrogations disguised as performance reviews. A special counterintelligence working group was formed, codenamed Volchok, tasked with tracing the leak back to its origin. But the deeper they looked, the murkier the picture became. No communications had been intercepted, no known defectors had surfaced, and none of the compromised agents had reported suspicious contact prior to their arrests. The confusion was as strategic as it was psychological. The CIA, knowing full well the potency of their source, refused to acknowledge it existed. The love letter never appeared in any official report. It was classified under an internal code, Echo Lantern. Only a handful of operatives even knew it. Had been the trigger. To the Soviets, the breach felt spectral, an invisible hand turning their own systems against them. Too precise for coincidence, too sudden for sabotage. And somewhere in East Berlin, unaware of the chain reaction his trembling words had set in motion, Alexei Morozov remained frozen in limbo, already condemned by silence, while 1,000 miles away, his final declaration of love continued dismantling the very machinery that had once taught him how to lie. Annika Bauer was taken before sunrise, her door splintering inward under the boots of 3 Stasi officers who entered without warning, without preamble, their faces expressionless as they produced the warrant marked with the chilling term Staatsfeindliche Verbindungen, enemy state affiliations. She had barely pulled on a coat before they bound her wrists and led her down the stairwell, while the elderly woman from across the hall pretended not to watch. At headquarters in Lichtenberg, she was placed in a dim interrogation cell, furnished only with a table, 2 chairs, and a single exposed bulb that swung faintly overhead like a metronome of dread. The questions began almost immediately, blunt, circular, delivered in clipped tones. How long have you known Alexei Morozov? When did he first speak of the embassy? Did he mention Moscow? Did he ever hand you documents? Did you pass any information to your cousin in the West? She answered as best she could, her voice thin and cracking but unshaken. She had known Alexei as a diplomat, nothing more, and if there was more to him, he never showed it. She had no knowledge of espionage, she had passed nothing to anyone. But the Stasi didn't need proof, they needed alignment. After hours of silence, followed by sudden bursts of shouted accusation, they produced a folder and began reading aloud excerpts from the letters they had seized during the raid. Her own words, torn from their context, now used to implicate her in a narrative she hadn't written. In one letter, she had written, "I dream of the day when you don't have to carry shadows on your shoulders anymore," a phrase they latched onto as evidence of awareness. In another, "The world you live in has rules I'll never understand, but I see how it's killing you." Proof, they insisted, that she had known his true identity, and the most damning, written just weeks before his disappearance. "If loving you makes me guilty, then I hope they lock me away for it, because I'll never regret knowing your real self." That line alone was enough. The interrogators, now emboldened, reframed her every expression of affection as complicity, every metaphor as code, every silence as evidence. Her protests only confirmed their theory. Only the guilty deny so fervently. Over the following days, she was held in isolation, deprived of light and regular meals, subjected to further questioning disguised as conversation. Her requests for legal representation were denied. Her cousin Christian had already gone underground after learning of her arrest, and no advocate dared associate with a woman labeled as Volksschädling, a social contaminant. Within 2 weeks, she was sentenced without trial to 18 months in a women's correctional facility under the vague but flexible charge of anti-state intimacy, a term used to criminalize relationships that blurred ideological lines. The facility was cold and overcrowded, and her cellmate was a former literature professor imprisoned for distributing banned Hungarian poetry. At night, Annika would lie awake on her thin cot and think of Alexei, not with anger or longing, but with a numb grief at the absurdity of it all, that love, real or imagined, could be reclassified as treason, and that her heart had become both a confession and a sentence. When the order came, it was not through a courier or encoded transmission, but as a sealed envelope slid silently across his desk during a shift at the embassy's cultural liaison office. A white envelope with no insignia, only his name typed in cold black letters, and inside, a single page marked with reassignment orders bearing the unmistakable authority of Directorate HR2. There was no explanation, no farewell, only instructions to report to a military transport hub in Minsk within 72 hours. Destination, classified. Alexei Morozov packed his few belongings in silence, leaving behind his books, his tailored overcoat, and a half-written letter to Annika he had no way to deliver, because by now he understood Moscow had decided he was compromised, not by evidence but by proximity to scandal, and though they could not prove his guilt, they had no interest in defending his innocence. Upon arrival in Moscow, he was detained briefly, not in a prison, but in a nameless gray building, where he was questioned not about espionage, but about behavior, emotional deviation, and lapses in judgment. The interrogators were cold but clinical, never accusing him directly, only reciting fragments, missed signals, inconsistent reports, behavioral anomalies. When asked if he had fallen in love with a German civilian, he said nothing. That silence sealed his fate more surely than any confession. He was not executed, perhaps because he still held valuable knowledge, or perhaps because someone within the hierarchy pitied the pathetic poetry of his dissent. But he was erased all the same. His personnel file was updated with a fabricated disciplinary infraction, and he was quietly reassigned to a communications outpost outside Norilsk, deep in the Siberian Arctic, where snow buried entire buildings each winter, and the air was so dry it cracked lips within minutes. The outpost was officially listed as a civilian meteorological station, but in truth it served as a silent gulag for disgraced operatives, a place where men once entrusted with state secrets became shadows, filing daily reports on cloud movement and solar anomalies no one would ever read. There were no telephones, only a telegraph machine monitored by Central Command, and no visitors. Alexei worked 12-hour shifts, logging atmospheric data, repairing antennae in minus 40-degree wind, and reading dog-eared Pushkin novels by kerosene lamp. Months turned to years. He stopped asking questions. His name disappeared from active rosters in Moscow, and eventually even the KGB's internal registry marked him as inactive, non-operational, the bureaucratic equivalent of a burial. No one ever confirmed his death, but no one inquired either. As for the operation he had once been part of, the one compromised by the poetic leak he hadn't known he'd authored, the KGB never acknowledged its failure, not in reports, not in memos, not even in whispered cautionary tales. The agents arrested in Europe were dismissed as unrelated exposures. The safe houses lost were written off as operational attrition. In the quiet parlance of the state, failure unspoken was failure undone. And so Alexei Morozov, once a rising star in Soviet intelligence, vanished not with a bullet or a trial, but with a shrug, a stamp, and a file quietly moved to the archive's bottom drawer, never to be opened again. In the spring of '94, long after the Berlin Wall had crumbled into souvenirs and the Soviet Union had dissolved into disillusionment and debt, a junior CIA archivist named Daniel Keene, 29 years old and freshly transferred from Langley to a declassification unit in Frankfurt, stumbled across an obscure document buried within a crate labeled Analytical, Europe, 1982 to 1985, restricted, pending review. His task was administrative, catalog, scan, and log documents for potential public release. But as he sifted through dog-eared folders and faded carbon copies, he came upon a memo marked Echo Lantern, a phrase that rang no bells in any official index but carried a red tag flag that meant it had once touched someone high up. Inside was a copy of the handwritten love letter, scanned and translated, with annotations scrawled in the margins by linguistics officers and operations analysts, all circling the same conclusion. This seemingly innocent letter, filled with poetic metaphors and declarations of longing, had contained structural code patterns mirroring KGB communication protocols. Intrigued, Keene dug deeper, requesting adjacent files under the same operational keyword, and what began as routine paperwork spiraled into a revelatory audit. Attached to Echo Lantern were field summaries of 6 compromised Soviet assets, arrest records, interrogation notes, safehouse blueprints, and an internal CIA memo dated February 1983 stating that source remains unidentified, likely proximity compromise. Yet nowhere did the source itself appear, only the ciphered letter, always referenced, never explained. Keene, hungry for credit and driven by the obsessive instinct shared by all true archivists, cross-referenced the language patterns against older surveillance logs and found the tape transcript from the Bonn Linguistics Division, the original analysis from the voice recording Christian Bauer had provided through unofficial channels. It clicked. The tape and the letter were from the same man. And the man was never unmasked, not because he had escaped detection, but because no one had thought to suspect a KGB officer might have compromised his own operation, not through betrayal, but through love. It was all there, scattered in pieces. A diplomat who had vanished, a German student imprisoned and later released under amnesty, a chain of arrests in Western Europe attributed to anonymous tips, and a surge in Soviet internal audits around the same months. Keene compiled it all into a report, sent it up the chain under the header Unattributed Compromise, Probable Internal Error, and it reached a senior analyst who, after reading it, allegedly muttered, "So the bastard sang, but only in verse." The report was sealed, marked Historical Interest Only, and filed into a non-public annex of the CIA's Cold War Compromise Archive. The story never made it into official retrospectives or briefings, but among a small group of intelligence historians, the tale spread quietly. that one of the most effective intelligence disruptions of the early 80s hadn't come from a mole, a bug, or a double agent, but from a man who fell in love with a woman who saw him as human, not weapon. Alexei Morozov hadn't betrayed his country. His country had simply never accounted for his heart. If this story moved you, there's more where that came from. Cold War history isn't just about spies and secrets. It's about human choices, emotional consequences, and the moments that change nations without a single shot fired. Subscribe now for more true stories from the hidden corridors of history, where love, betrayal, and geopolitics collide. Like, subscribe, share, because sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the human heart.